Welcome back to my channel. I'm hoping all is well with you all. We will be talking about Amelia Dyer, a serial killer who was not caught for 30 years. She was a sick and twisted woman. Let's talk about the baby killer Dyer. Amelia Elizabeth Dyer, 1836 June 10, 1896, was an English serial killer who murdered infants in her care over 30 years during the Victorian era of the United Kingdom. One-two trained as a nurse and widowed in 1869. Dyer turned to baby farming, the practice of adopting unwanted infants in exchange for money to support herself. She initially cared for the children legitimately, in addition to having two of her own, but whether intentionally or not, a number of them died in her care, leading to a conviction for neglect and 6 months of hard labor. She then began directly murdering children she adopted, strangling at least some of them, and disposing of the bodies to avoid attention. Mentally unstable, she was committed to several mental asylums throughout her life, despite suspicions of feigning, and survived at least one serious suicide attempt. Dyer's downfall came when the bagged corpse of an infant was discovered in the River Thames, with evidence leading to her. She was arrested on April 4, 1896. In one of the most sensational trials of the Victorian period, she was found guilty of the murder of infant Doris Marman and hanged on 10 June 1896. At the time of her death, a handful of murders were attributed to Dyer, but there is little doubt she was responsible for many more similar deaths, possibly for 100 or more, making her a candidate for history's most prolific serial killer. Amelia Dyer was born the youngest of 5 with 3 brothers, Thomas, James, and William, and a sister, Anne, in the small village of Pile Marsh, just east of Bristol, the daughter of master shoemaker Samuel Hobley and Sarah Hobley Weymouth. Amelia learned to read and write and developed a love of literature and poetry. However, her childhood was marred by the mental illness of her mother, caused by typhus. Amelia witnessed her mother's violent fits and was obliged to care for her until she died in 1848. Researchers later commented on the effect this had on Dyer, and also what it taught her about the symptoms exhibited by those who appeared to lose their minds through illness. Dyer had an elder sister, Sarah Ann, who died in 1841 at age 6, and a younger sister, also named Sarah Ann, who died in 1845, aged a few months. An elder cousin had an illegitimate daughter at the time who was later accepted as the daughter of the grandparents, William and Martha Hobley, who was Dyer's aunt and uncle. After her mother's death, Amelia lived with an aunt in Bristol for a time before serving an apprenticeship with a corset maker. Her father died in 1859. Her eldest brother, Thomas, inherited the family shoe business. In 1861, at the age of 24, Amelia became permanently estranged from at least one of her brothers, James, and moved into lodgings in Trinity Street, Bristol. There she married George Thomas. George was 59, and they both lied about their ages on the marriage certificate to reduce the age gap. George deducted 11 years from his age and Amelia added 6 years to hers. Many sources later reported this age as fact, causing much confusion. After marrying George Thomas, Dyer trained as a nurse. From contact with a midwife, Ellen Dane, she learned of an easier way to earn a living using her own home to provide lodgings for young women who had conceived illegitimately and then farming off the babies for adoption or allowing them to die of neglect and malnutrition. Dane was forced to decamp to the US shortly after meeting Amelia to escape the attention of the author. Its unmarried mothers during the Victorian period often struggled to gain an income since the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act had removed any financial obligation from the fathers of illegitimate children, whilst bringing up their children in a society where single parenthood and illegitimacy were stigmatized. This led to the practice of baby farming, in which individuals acted as adoption or fostering agents in return for regular payments or a single, upfront fee from the baby's mothers. Many businesses were set up to take in these young women and care for them until they gave birth. The mothers subsequently left their unwanted babies to be looked after as nurse children. The predicament of the parents involved was often exploited for financial gain. If a baby had well-off parents who wanted to keep the birth secret, the single fee might be as much as £80. £50 might be negotiated if the father of the child wanted to hush up his involvement. However, it was more common for these expectant young women to be impoverished. Such women would be charged about £5. Unscrupulous carers resorted to starving the farmed-out babies to save money and even to hasten death. Noisy or demanding babies could be sedated with easily available alcohol and/or opiates. Godfrey's cordial, known colloquially as mother's friend, a syrup containing opium, was a frequent. But there were several other similar preparations. Many children died as a result of such dubious practices. Opium killed far more infants through starvation than directly through overdose. Dr. Greenhow, investigating for the Privy Council, noted how children kept in a state of continued narcotism will be thereby disinclined for food and be but imperfectly nourished. Death from severe malnutrition would result, but the coroner was likely to record the death as debility from birth, lack of breast milk, or simply starvation. 10 mothers who chose to reclaim or simply check on the welfare of their children could often encounter difficulties, but some would simply be too frightened or ashamed to tell the police about any suspected wrongdoing. Even the authorities often had problems tracing any children that were reported missing. This was the world opened up to her by the now departed Ellen Dane. Dyer had to leave nursing with the birth of a daughter, Ellen Thomas. In 1869, the elderly George Thomas died and Amelia needed an income. Dyer was keen to make money from baby farming, and alongside taking in expectant women, she advertised to nurse and adopt a baby in return. A substantial one-off payment and adequate clothing for the child. In her advertisements and meetings with clients, she assured them that she was respectable and married and that she would provide a safe and loving home for the child. In 1872, Amelia married William Dyer, a brewer's laborer from Bristol. They had 2 children together, Mary Ann, also known as Polly, and William Samuel. Amelia eventually left her husband. At some point in her baby farming career, Dyer decided to forego the expense and inconvenience of letting the children die through neglect and starvation. Soon after the receipt of each child, she murdered them, thus allowing her to pocket most or all of the fee. For some time, Dyer eluded the resulting interest of the police. She was eventually caught in 1879 after a doctor was suspicious about the number of child deaths he had been called to certify in Dyer's care. However, instead of being convicted of murder or manslaughter, she was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor. The experience allegedly almost destroyed her mentally, though others have expressed incredulity at the leniency of the sentence when compared to those handed out for lesser crimes at that. Upon release, she attempted to resume her nursing career. She had spells in mental hospitals due to mental instability and suicidal tendencies. These always coincided with times when it was convenient for her to disappear. Being a former asylum nurse, Dyer knew how to behave to ensure a relatively comfortable existence as an asylum inmate. Dyer appears to have begun abusing alcohol and opium-based products early in her killing career. Her mental instability could have been related to her substance abuse. In 1890, Dyer cared for the illegitimate baby of a governess. When she returned to visit the child, the governess was immediately suspicious and stripped the baby to see if a birthmark was present on one of its hips. It wasn't, and prolonged suspicions by the authorities led to Dyer having, or feigning, a breakdown. Dyer at one point drank 2 bottles of laudanum in a serious suicide attempt, but her long-term use had built up her tolerance to opium products, so she survived. She returned to baby farming and murder. Dyer realized the folly of involving doctors to issue death certificates and began disposing of the bodies herself. The precarious nature and extent of her activities again prompted undesirable attention. She was alert to the attention of police and of parents seeking to reclaim their children. She and her family frequently relocated to different towns and cities to escape suspicion, regain anonymity, and acquire new businesses. Over the years, Dyer used a succession of aliases. In 1893, Dyer was discharged from her final committal at the Somerset and Bath Lunatic Asylum near Wells. 12. Unlike previous breakdowns, this had been a most disagreeable experience and she never entered another asylum. 2 years later, Dyer moved to Caversham, Berkshire, accompanied by an unsuspecting associate, Jane Granny Smith, whom Dyer had recruited from a brief spell in a workhouse, and Dyer's daughter and son-in-law, Mary Ann, known as Polly and Arthur Palmer. This was followed by a move to 45 Kensington Road, Reading, Berkshire later the same year. Smith was persuaded by Dyer to be referred to as a mother in front of innocent women handing over their children. This was an effort to present a caring mother-daughter image. In January 1896, Evelina Marmon, a popular 25-year-old barmaid, gave birth to an illegitimate daughter, Doris, in a boarding house in Cheltenham. She quickly sought offers of adoption and placed an advertisement in the miscellaneous section of the Bristol Times and Mirror newspaper. It simply read, "Wanted, respectable woman to take a young child." Marmon intended to go back to work and hoped to eventually reclaim her child. Coincidentally, next to her own, was an advertisement reading, "Married couple with no family would adopt a healthy child, nice country home. Terms, £10. Marmon responded to a Mrs. Harding, and a few days later she received a reply from Dyer, from Oxford Road in Reading. Mrs. Harding wrote that I should be glad to have a dear baby girl, one I could bring up and call my own. She continued, "We are plain, homely people, in fairly good circumstances. I don't want a child for money's sake, but the company and home comfort. I and my husband are dearly fond of children. I have no child of my own. A child with me will have a good home and a mother's love." Evelina Marmon wanted to pay a more affordable, weekly fee for the care of her daughter, but Mrs. Harding insisted on being given the one-off payment in advance. Marmon was in dire straits, so she reluctantly agreed to pay the £10, and a week later Mrs. Harding arrived in Kelton Hampton onto Gloucester. She returned to her lodgings a broken woman. A few days later, she received a letter from Mrs. Harding saying all was well. Marmon wrote back but received no reply. Dyer did not travel to Reading, as she had told Marmon. She went instead to 76 Mayo Road, Willesden, London, where her 23-year-old daughter Polly was staying. There, Dyer quickly found some white edging tape used in dressmaking, wound it twice around the baby's neck, and tied a knot. Death would not have been immediate, Dyer later said. I used to like to watch them with the tape around their neck, but it was soon all over with them. Both women allegedly helped to wrap the body in a napkin. They kept some of the clothes Marmon had packed. The rest was destined for the pawnbroker. Dyer paid the rent to the unwitting landlady and gave her a pair of child's boots as a present for her little girl. The following day, Wednesday, April 1, 1896, another child, named Harry Simmons, was taken to Mayo Road. However, with no spare white edging tape available, the length around Doris's corpse was removed and used to strangle the 13-month-old boy. On 2 April, both bodies were stacked into a carpet bag, along with bricks for added weight. Dyer then headed for Reading. At a secluded spot she knew well near a weir at Caversham Lock, she forced the carpetbag through railings into the River Thames. Unbeknownst to Dyer, on March 30, 1896, a package was retrieved from the Thames at Reading by a bargeman. The package Dyer dumped was not weighted adequately and had been easily spotted. It contained the body of a baby girl, later identified as Helena Fry, in the small detective force available to Reading Borough Police, Detective Constable Anderson made a crucial breakthrough. As well as finding a label from Temple Mead Station, Bristol, he used microscopic analysis of the wrapping paper and deciphered a faintly legible name, Mrs. Thomas, and an address. This evidence was enough to lead police to Dyer, but they still had no strong evidence to connect her directly with a serious crime. Additional evidence they gleaned from witnesses and information obtained from Bristol police only served to increase their concerns. And D.C. Anderson, with CTT, James placed Dyer's home under surveillance. Subsequent intelligence suggested that Dyer would abscond if she came at all under suspicion. The officers decided to use a young woman as a decoy, hoping she would be able to secure a meeting with Dyer to discuss her services. It transpired that Dyer was expecting her new client, the decoy, to call, but instead, she found detectives waiting on her doorstep. On 3 April, Good Friday, the police raided her home. They were struck by the stench of human decomposition, although no human remains were found. There was, however. The police calculated that in the previous few months alone, at least 20 children had been placed in the care of a Mrs. Thomas, now revealed to be Amelia Dyer. It also appeared that she was about to move home again, this time to Somerset. This rate of murder has led to some estimates that Mrs. Dyer may, over decades, have killed over 400 babies and children, making her one of the most prolific murderers ever. Dyer was arrested on 4 April and charged with murder. Her son-in-law Arthur Palmer was charged as an accessory. During April, the Thames was dredged and 6 more bodies were discovered, including Doris Marmon and Harry Simmons, Dyer's last victims. Each baby had been strangled with white tape, which, as she later told the police, was how you could tell it was one of mine. 11 days after handing her daughter to Dyer, Evelina Marmon, whose name had emerged, Dyer was hanged by James Billington at Newgate Prison on Wednesday, June 10, 1896. Asked on the scaffold if she had anything to say, she said, "I have nothing to say." Just before being dropped to hang at 9 a.m. precisely, she showed no remorse in the end. I truly appreciate you all spending your time with me to let me tell you this horrible story to you. Some people are beyond redemption in this world.